Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report, and we have just some news items here and there. A lot of European news, surprisingly, but we'll get started with probably the more active Middle Eastern news because a lot went down there, and we're going to do a little bit of returning to tradition and start with Syria. So, there's been activity in, of course, northeastern Syria. The opposition made an offensive, which they took heavy casualties during, and this seems like one of those last-ditch effort sort of offenses. As I'm sure nobody's surprised seeing these sort of things. Surprisingly enough, you haven't heard about a lot of suicide attacks coming out of northwestern Syria, that is, or northeastern Syria, or Syria in general, for that matter. You figure you would hear more about the suicide bombings, but I wonder if that's just been a tactic that's sort of obsolete now, with all things considered. I mean, but regardless, you see the Russians and the pro-government forces pushing further into the Idlib area, and like I said, I'm sticking to my prediction I made at the end of last show that this is the last summer of Idlib. That by the end of this year, at the latest, I believe Idlib will have been mostly, if not fully, capitulated to the Syrian government, whether that be through brute force, whether that be through negotiation, etc. I think we're going to enter another diplomatic phase in Syria, as I've been saying, where you have the various powers, whether that be Russia, Iran, Turkey, probably France and Germany, isolating the U.S. from these talks, and UK for that matter, because, again, just with the direction the conflict's been going, hell, maybe even Israel, depending on how things go, because apparently Israel is in the midst of another political crisis. And again, we'll get into some stuff there with the riots and protests, as well as the dissatisfaction with the Likud government. But Russia has been restoring dilapidated and damaged oil wells in Syria in particular, which has helped boost the local economy, despite a lot of parts in Syria, if not Syria as a whole, is entering into a recession, economic weakness, which is still pretty remarkable how strong their economy is considering the past decade of all things. But again, it's still a downturn, still a slump. And you'll notice historically when there is an increase of standards of living, increase in economy, and then you hit a downturn, that's when you're actually most likely to get a revolution, because that's when people's hopes get dashed. That's when people thought things were going, they feel particularly mad. If they're at the bottom and, they don't really see a way to go up, they accept their lot in life, more or less. But it looks like one of these cases where I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it may cause discontent with the Syrian government, where things have been more or less on a track that seems like, oh yeah, things are improving, and if they take a dip, that might lead to some discontent in eastern Syria, northeastern Syria, etc. Not to mention with the still volatility of the situation, that could lead to maybe a resurgence, a brief resurgence in ISIS or some other jihadist group. Again, there's Syria. It may seem that the war has stabilized, but there's still chances for these little flare-ups. Now, I don't think there's anything that will engulf the country in a full civil war that we saw, for example, in 2014, 2015. I think those days are gone. And as I said, I think any real long-term solution in Syria is going to be done diplomatically rather than militarily at this point, because as I keep on going back to, you look at the battle lines that have been drawn since the U.S. quote unquote withdrawal and the Turkish involvement in October 2019. It looks like these have stabilized. You've had, again, a dividing line along the Euphrates, with everything west of it belonging to the Syrian government, more or less, and everything east of it belonging to the Syrian quote unquote democratic forces, with mainly Kurdish groups in charge. And again, no surprise, the main action out of Syria this week is in the Idlib province in northwestern Syria, with Turkish actions and really just the devolving into infighting in Idlib, which has been ongoing for the past year and a half at this point, where it's not really surprised that all these groups are at each other's throats, that they're baying for each other's blood at this point, while the pro-government forces and Russian forces crack down on them ever increasingly. But again, you still get these last-ditch effort attacks like you got today that, again, mount heavy casualties. It could be a case where, I'm not sure whether this was a pro-Turkish group, an anti-Turkish group, it just said an opposition force, where Turkey said, just sent them into the meat grinder to slow them down a bit and to tie up loose ends. So, again, things are bubbling under the surface in Syria, and we're probably due for I would say we're due for a pretty eventful summer in Syria, whether that be military, diplomatically, or both. And to top it all off, there is a drought in the region in eastern Syria, in western Iraq. So, on top of everything, just environmental weather causes is making life at least temporarily more difficult for the region. We'll see the impacts of that probably within the coming weeks, coming maybe even coming days.
Right. One of the indicators that there's a good chance that this might be the last summer of Idlib is there's been a departure from particularly 2018 and 2019 when the war in Idlib was far hotter. And what you had were not just Turkish proxies, but actual Turkish soldiers proper fighting it out with the Syrians. That's much rarer now. This week, there was an improvised cannon created by a group associated with Al Qaeda that fired against SAA, the Syrian Arab Army. But they were, quickly disprivileged of their military position. They were retaliated against. So I don't, you know, Turkey has 60 outposts at least around that perimeter, but I don't hear a lot of involvement nor a lot of complaining, particularly when Russia is like literally bombing the outskirts and the suburbs of Idlib city, which is the largest city or town in Greater Idlib. So the Turks are very much focused on the Kurds in Iraq, and the deduction from the terrorists in Idlib, whether they are ISIS or Al Qaeda or Al Sham, which is also Al Qaeda affiliated, is that as long as ISIS is keeping Syrian and Russian forces occupied in the central desert, but in the eastern half of the central desert and Deir ez-Zor, then maybe we can mount an attack here. And that hasn't materialized. Even if there was this week an attack on Syrian soldiers, as well as a brigade of Palestinians that are fighting along with Syrian forces. Apparently, 14, pardon me, 14 were killed or wounded. Nonetheless, it has not helped Idlib, the fighters in Idlib to regain any land that they've lost in well over a year or two. The other bit of news is Israel launching missiles very close to Latakia, which is where the Russian military base is situated. This is their naval base. Most of the missiles were all intercepted, but that to me is signaling that Israel is very unhappy with the situation. They know that this is going to anger Putin. I think they're signaling to him. They're probably upset that the Al Qaeda affiliated groups in Idlib are not able to mount any attack, and that Turkey, for the most part, is not coming to their rescue whatsoever. So I think that's where the anger probably lies. But it will get more into Israel, and there is a tie-in with news in Israel now with what I'm
Oh,
talking about.
yes, and I think that's the perfect time to get into it since we covered the news about Syria, which again was mostly peripheral. So it is Al Quds Day, which to my understanding is when again, it's one of the big days back from the 40s when Israel was first established that had a lot to do with displacement of Palestinians. So all across the Arab world, in which case Arab consciousness still exists. I mean, you even had demonstrations in Yemen about this. I imagine Syria, of course, even if it's just a government-sponsored thing because of their foreign policy. But of course, Palestine in particular, you have these demonstrations. You had, of course, Israel cracking down heavily on these demonstrations, which leads to rioting and just general street violence. And they actually went after what was it, the Al Aqsa Mosque, which is the really big one, very important one that they I think they want to turn into a synagogue for some fringe Jewish end times
Yeah,
prophecy thing. But
we
you,
have the red heifer, the red heifer
yes, and
born.
with all of this, with them launching missiles into Syria, I think the broader implications of what we're seeing right here is that I don't know. I think this reeks of desperation. The fact that Israel is, I mean, not that Israel hasn't cracked down on these sort of things before, but it just seems like the manner in which all of this is happening and at the timing and with the events outside of Israel's border, such as U.S. Iranian negotiations that even involve Saudi Arabia now, Hezbollah backing those negotiations, Syria being all but finished with, again, it potentially being the last summer of Idlib. It just seems like there's a lot of desperation coming out of Tel Aviv right now, and that they want to crack down on this. They want to go hard, not to mention the instability of the Israeli government with Netanyahu's disapproval rates climbing, people supporting opposition coalitions to him, whether that be Gantz or any of these other politicians, to form a coalition government to get Netanyahu out of office finally. But I don't know. I think this like really heavy-handed show of force was the sign of a weak regime. And I'm not saying that's universally the case because, again, I think, for example, we'll take Belarus. I think even though the crackdowns in somewhere like Belarus or even Russia with Navalny may have been heavy handed, it's because, again, that was to make an example of those people, that was to assert yourself. But just when you get these kind of things in a so called democratic country, in a liberal country, when you have these heavy crackdowns, in my opinion at least, now it could be wrong or you might disagree with me, whatever, it seems like the sign of a very fragile regime. And again, with the Yellow Vest protests in France, or and pretty much any protest in the Western world that actually has any meaning to it that gets heavily cracked down upon, I think it shows the instability of liberal democratic regimes in particular, and I think that's what we're witnessing in Israel right now over not only the past few months, not only the past year, but I would say since what 2017, 2018, they've been on this level of instability when the U.S. became. I would pinpoint it at the point where Trump did a one-time strike in Syria in 2018, where he promised this large strike and he hit a few targets, used some bunker busters, whatever, but really just said you're on your own, chief, after that. And that, I mean, just 2 months after Trump's second Syria strike, you had Daraa, the cradle of revolution, fall. You had the siege on Idlib begin in full. You had a lot of cleaning up in the west of the Euphrates, cleaning up those last pockets of ISIS, Al Qaeda, etc. And that's, of course, when the Kurds also started to occupy that eastern side of the Euphrates. So, again, I think at some point in 2018, they realize, okay, yeah, Trump may be loyal to us. Trump may give us a lot of what we want with the embassy, with one-time Syria strikes, but we don't think he's a reliable partner. And I think that's when the concern in Israel really started to pick up. I think it was festering under Obama, especially with the failed regime change in Syria and a lot of his other Middle Eastern policies, such as the Iran deal. But I think they thought they had a shoe-in with Trump, and when they realized maybe he's not that reliable, they got concerned. And I think they also thought they had more of a friend in Biden, but again, just the geopolitical state of the U.S. isn't what it was even 5, 10 years ago. So again, I just smell a lot of Israeli desperation right now, and I think that will continue. I think that will escalate, and I think they will act more belligerent as that happens, trying to assert themselves, trying to assert their strength, especially Netanyahu in particular, who's fighting for his life to stay in office right now. And really, all I can say is, yeah, expect Israel to. I mean, I expect them to do some pretty outlandish things, maybe fire some missiles into Yemen once, or just these ridiculous shows of force. And as you were telling us about the war games they had planned, I think you know a little bit more
Yeah.
about those. And I think you should tell them the wonderful, definitely not a LARP name that the IDF picked for their war games.
So Israel is going to conduct a war game or a war exercise, a military exercise, if you will. It's been dubbed Chariots of Fire. It's slated to last 1 month in a simulated war against Hamas and Hezbollah. So you're going to see training happening near the Gaza Strip, maybe even, I don't know, they might create a scenario where they're hiding out in the Sinai. I have no idea, but my guess is they're going to have these exercises in and around Palestinian settlements, particularly Gaza, and then they're going to go to the Golan Heights, uh, where they're going to simulate what it would be like to be at war for a month with both these groups, neither of which have a navy or an air force, or they don't even have ground to air missiles. But that's going to be an interesting sign of force. At the moment, though, there are thousands of people that are going to be going to the Al-Aqsa Mosque for the Night of Destiny. It's apparently their most sacred night for the month of Ramadan. So, you know, people might remember, if you're old enough, the Intifada. Israel provoked the Palestinians, and they did so intentionally so that they could have a reaction in order that they could make the reasons for why they have to have more settlements, why a wall has to be built, which America helped them build that wall. The irony. And so, I think tensions are going to continue to escalate in Israel, particularly for Ramadan. And who knows? Who knows where this is going to go? And it'll be interesting to watch the Chariots of Fire exercise, because it's going to go on for a month. Anything's possible. You could have a gay op that happens during this time. It would be convenient for something like that to happen. A lot of gay ops are preceded by an actual exercise, a week before, and where there was a training conducted for a mass shooter. Boston Marathon bombing. Take your pick. There's many of them. Or
9/11, I think that's probably the biggest one you can
yeah,
point to. The national security
San,
drills that were
San
happening just.
Bernardino shooting.
Yeah, yeah.
The San Bernardino shooting literally happened in the building where the training exercise happened. Literally happened in the same building, just a week later. And there was even, anyhow, we're not going to get into it, but it's a rife time, right? Because we live in a highly visual oriented world. Uh, People are reading much less, and they're not as scrupulous in examining videos. No matter how much people are more aware of Photoshop, but then the flip side of that is people also hardly believe. In many ways, they can find it very hard to believe just about anything, because they believe anything can be photoshopped. So it's this strange game that's being played out in simulation land.
Oh yes, and like I said, I would agree that this is probably preceding something. I wouldn't say big, but bigger than we've seen in quite some time. And I would say
Hmm.
it goes down to Israeli desperation. They feel desperate now that, again, after cycling through three U.S. presidents who were unreliable, the most reliable arguably being Trump, who, that's not that high of a bar, if if you haven't noticed. But again, I think they feel like they're going to have to take matters into their own hands. I would say this is probably the geopolitically weakest Israel has been, the worst positions they've been in since 1967. I know that's a bold claim, but I'm going to say that because, again, sure, they have their friendship with Egypt. Sure, they have their quote unquote friendship with Jordan. I suppose quote unquote friendship for both of them. They have those fronts secured where there's not going to be a real surprise attack. And again, especially with American guarantees about that. But I do think they fear their northern flank with what Hezbollah can do, with what Syria can do, with what all these Iranian groups can do, and not even in a conventional way, in just a very asymmetric way. Need I point out the 2006 Lebanon War? Need I point out the past, what, 5 years of conflict in Syria and the growth and capabilities of the groups? Whereas, yeah, they can, at this point, pretty much overwhelm the Iron Dome if they would pick a time to have a concerted effort with the forces in Gaza, with the forces in Lebanon, with the forces in Syria. And again, I really think that in Tel Aviv, they're feeling desperate. I think Netanyahu is not only feeling desperate because of Israel's strategic situation, but because of his own personal situation. And I think that's going to lend itself to very drastic actions in the coming months. Now, it could be this could go a few different directions. They do it; it's a one-time thing. Everyone shuts up about it. They do it; it backfires on them, and again, they're forced to concede and negotiate with the powers of the region. I don't know. Maybe Putin will really claim the title of kingmaker of the Middle East, as he was. Again, you saw Putin in what 2017, 2018, really trying to broker at least a temporary peace between Iran and Israel. It was around, yes, it would have been around 2018 because that's when the Iran deal fell apart. And, speaking of the Iran deal, you already have the U.S. bringing Saudi Arabia to the negotiation table with Iran as they're trying to salvage some sort of deal with the Iranians right now. And it looks like I don't think it's going to be anything spectacular. Maybe it will lead to a backlash in Iran with their upcoming presidential elections, where the hardliners take power who don't want to negotiate with the U.S. But if Rouhani can get maybe a last minute deal, even if this is like a lame duck term for him, even if he does get out, then that's going to, I think, force Israel into a very uncomfortable position. And arguably, it's better to take a chance with a hawkish Iran with a, I can't remember the name off the top of his head, but it's one of Soleimani's lieutenants who's actually one of the favored presidential contenders for this upcoming election. It arguably would be better for Israel to get somebody like that in office so they could justify the more aggressive actions and actually have more lateral room to move because, again, Iran's being more aggressive. They're not willing to negotiate with the U.S. Whereas right now it looks very one sided that Israel is the aggressor. I mean, I think they are, but again, on the world stage, it looks like Israel's the aggressor with an Iran that's willing to come to the bargaining table. So, again, we could see some interesting dynamics play out, and I think a lot is contingent on the upcoming Iranian presidential elections within that'll take place within the next year. I don't know the exact date, but I know that soon Rouhani's leadership will be put up to a public referendum. And again, I'm not saying the elections in Iran are the most legitimate in the world, but there is some form of democracy. Of course, the candidates have to be approved by the mullahs, etc. It's more democratic, I would say, than most countries in the region, believe it or not, which is a bit of irony, but we'll see how that works. But again, we'll see how the Iranian people feel about this, and I wouldn't be surprised maybe if this Lieutenant of Soleimani's doesn't win, if Rouhani loses just to anyone, because at this point, I don't see how he can maintain his mandate with the mullahs, with the Iranian people, with even his allies in Russia and China. I'm sure that Russia and China have been supporters of him, but I think they might want somebody who is better suited for the position, so to speak. But if all I'm getting at is I don't expect Rouhani's administration to last long, Rouhani's regime to last long, and I expect to be replaced by one, probably one, if not completely hardline, much more hardline than his more quote unquote moderate government.
Right. I mean, considering the last 2 weeks, Iran has had many gains. If we're going to be honest about it, we saw Saudi Arabia nearly capitulating indirectly to Iran by praising the Houthis in Yemen, considering them fellow Arabs and essentially proud of them for being such great fighters. Those words alone will completely demoralize Saudi troops, the Saudi public, and the other forces fighting on behalf of the Saudis. I mean, that's going to resonate everywhere in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, including on the northwest flank towards Israel. Not a happy moment. Israel is well aware why having let's say, a country or a regime sympathetic to Iran, the entrance into the Red Sea is not, an obstacle. We saw what could happen with shipping lanes in that region. We know that Israel has played with the idea of an alternative route to the Mediterranean, other than that being used currently in Egypt. So, of course, they would love that. So, there are big plans, and many of these plans, and one of the reasons we have this show is these plans often take decades to complete. An entire decade, it may take an entire decades just to have step one and two. Doesn't mean they're always come into fruition, but that's how far countries and civilizations have to plan. So it's interesting to watch. It's not always just wild speculation, and even if we're wrong on something, it's not necessarily because that wasn't the case in the first place. It's just that plan cannot come into fruition. Maybe not ever because of, you know, external pressures, or maybe it will sometime down the road. But yeah, I agree with you. Iran is, as far as I'm concerned, they're on a roll. The JPCOA, I mean, they can have it or not have it. I don't think it even matters to them anymore. Uh, more sanctions are going to be less effective than they have been. I'm not minimizing the effectiveness of the sanctions, but the fact is there are already now, uh, you know, alternatives to SWIFT. I believe that will be finalized before the end of 2021. So countries like Russia and Iran will be able to eschew the whole SWIFT thing because China will have developed like another quick, money delivery system. So you don't have to do it with suitcases. In fact, that's what that's what one of the ministers for Russia said a few weeks back in reference to the European Union. If Russia's booted off the SWIFT, he goes, "Great, they can pay us in suitcases."
I mean,
So
I wouldn't turn it down, but that's just me.
yeah, so all to say, Iran has the upper hand here, and I think one of the other themes on this show is like time is running out more for the West and for America in terms of commanding the same kind of geopolitical power that they used to. Not the other way around. Like, I don't think the West and America can destabilize, um, their adversaries the way they could, and their own internal dynamics on a societal level, which we've seen the divisions growing. Whether we're talking about France, and now there's like over 8,000 officers that have signed this protest paper, of a oncoming civil war. I mean, the paper even suggests having a military takeover of the current government in order to prevent this. But some interesting statistics are that about 56% of the French public agrees with this. So I don't want to go off topic. We'll deal with France, but I'm just saying that there's going to be more instability in the West. We've always been saying that in this show, and that is bearing itself out. Every year we see more of this, and we don't see the color revolutions that the West tries to foment in Belarus or Russia or Iran, or in Hong Kong, China. Like, they're not successful.
Yeah, it's and again diminishing returns year by year, where you have these things, and maybe in what 2008 in Georgia, or wasn't there also one in 2008 in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, or was that in 2004? Can't remember. Point being is, you have these ones in the early
2000.
2000s, the 2006 Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, where these things had great effects, these things really had payoffs, but I would say it all fell apart around Ukraine when, Crimea got annexed. Because really, I think, again, it was this game of soft power, this game of prodding the other side, seeing what the response would be. Russia called their bluff on Crimea, and it paid off. And we talk about this all the time, how Crimea is the most significant geopolitical event, probably of look to put it in different terms. The century really begins about 15 to 20 years later, like culturally and politically, than it does on the actual calendar. You may think, for example, the 19th century didn't really begin until the Napoleonic Wars, or arguably until Napoleon was defeated with the Congress of Vienna and everything. The 20th century didn't really begin until World War One happened. I would say the 21st century did not really begin until Russia annexed Crimea. Now, you could say there were bigger events than that in the 21st century, of course. I think just based on ramifications, 9/11 was much more impactful than the annexation of Crimea. But in terms of like what caused a shift in geopolitics, because again, 9/11 again, I'm not downplaying the event or anything. A lot of people died. It was a major attack on the United States. Now you can discuss, who and how, and ask all these questions. But I think everyone can agree that it happened and it was a major event. But it didn't really change the geopolitical balance of the world in any major way. The United States was still the unchallenged hegemonic power of the world, marching into Afghanistan, which was a country that barely had a central government to make much of a difference. Marching into Iraq changed the geopolitical balance of the Middle East, admittedly, but I don't think it could be compared to the annexation of Crimea. Now, of course, you could say, and I do agree, all these events led to one another because, again, that's how these things work. But again, I would ultimately say the 21st century began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. But with that being said, I suppose we can move on to our European news with the German Green Party. The leader, Annelies Baerbock, has said she sees a lot of common ground with the U.S., sees a lot of common ground with being able to meet with them and agreeing with them a lot of policies, especially the Biden administration, which I said you were going to start seeing this in the Western media and expect around late summer, early fall, when the Germans actually do have their elections, to see this woman astroturfed all hell. I'm talking Navalny, Guaido levels of AstroTurf. Tinovskaya probably exceed Tinovskaya levels of AstroTurf. But I'm saying like Navalny level of AstroTurf right here. And it will be about, of course, it's going to be about the environment. It's going to be about protecting our natural resources, protecting the earth, and cracking down on climate change and global warming and climate refugee crisis and all these things they'll put together. But of course, it's all going to be about the Russian energy market and its relationship to Europe. And the focal point of that, of course, is going to be Nord Stream 2, which I believe on the time frame will be completed before then, correct? Or will it just still be nearing completion? I don't have the exact time frame in my head, but point being is it's past the point it's been past the point of no return for about 6 months now when it comes to Nord Stream. Probably even longer than that. But what you have here, of course, is this astroturfing of it. When again, I think Germany politically, I think they've stabilized over the past few years when it comes to I mean, even Merkel and the bureaucrats had to pull the plug on mass migration because, of course, they liked having a lot of those migrants come in. They liked having that new labor force. They liked having that wedge in society to divide people. But even after a certain point, they realized this is too much even for us to handle, so they turned that off. So things in Germany have more or less stabilized. It seems like the center right to the right wing in general. I wouldn't say they far from dominate society. Don't get me wrong. I'm not even trying to say that at all. But like the CDU with their centrist central right policies and Merkel's successor, yeah, I could see they're doing decent. Okay, and I would say I expect this successor of Merkel is the one who, again, got in the Twitter fight saying, well, maybe the war in Syria isn't as black and white as we think. Maybe all sides take some responsibility. We should look at this more objectively. He didn't he get in a fight with some, wasn't some, I think it was some British or American diplomat that he got into a fight with about that topic in
Yeah.
particular. But point being is a much more level head, much more willing to cooperate with Russia even than Merkel has been. And it seems like the one avenue they have right now, the one political avenue they have right now is green imperialism. And I think this isn't going to be exclusive to Germany. I think green parties throughout Europe are going to become the big recipients of State Department and American intelligence funds in order to, again, mess with the energy market in Europe. And, it isn't even like the two pronged attack where you have us trying, like, since under Trump, there was a logic to it. It was a long shot, but there was a logic to it. We cracked down on Russian energy imports and we replaced them with American energy imports. Biden's idea is we crack down on Russian energy imports and then you're on your own. Green energy, build some windmills or whatever. And even then, I think that the Biden administration, in a lot of these green moves, especially in Germany, are skeptical of nuclear power. Now, I've made it clear on my position. I think nuclear power is overrated. I think oil and gas are the best we have. I think a lot of the negative effects of those are heavily exaggerated. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I think they're heavily exaggerated. And I think really anyone trying to replace oil and gas or even introduce something beside it, even nuclear, I think is embarking on a fool's errand unless, I don't know, maybe you're a country like the size of Switzerland, but again, maybe I just don't understand energy source. Maybe I just don't understand how quite literal power works. But that's aside the point. And again, I think this is the first of a decade long trend that's going to continue under the Biden Kamala regime, where you have, again, these green parties propped up by the U.S. Because, again, also a lot of them do fit the very LGBTQ CIA agenda. Those two issues tend to go together. Now, in some countries, you
Yeah.
could argue there's an exception, but it seems like the perfect formula going forward into these big elections such as Germany, maybe even France. We'll see how that plays out. But again, all across Europe, especially ones that have energy ties with Russia.
There was a interesting video that the Atlanta Council released where she's interviewed by Zakaria, who's one of these experts that appears on CNN probably about once a week. He's also a fellow of the Atlanta Council, so that kind of tells you where he's going to stand. The interview was interesting because there was a lot of prep work before he got to the Nord Stream 2 question. But there were some priorities along the way which had to be cleared, almost as if he would be guessing at the kind of criticism that would be levied at her and her party should she win the election. And foremost was, can the Americans trust your party given the formation of the party? With respect to 1978, for people who don't know, the Green Party started out as an activist group. It had many contingents. Some were women's rights. Some of it was workers' rights,
Yeah, a
wage
lot of it
rights.
was
Some of
about
it,
for the withdrawal of nuclear weapons for Germany was like the one point
yeah,
they all agreed on.
yes, yes, quite right. So, but they also were responsible for planting bombs. And so they were rightly a terrorist organization. So you could see Zakaria knew what kind of criticism could be levied at the Green Party. In a way, he had to give her the opportunity to answer that, and of course she did. She's very giddy around Zakaria. She's like an excited schoolgirl, like who's about to win the pageant.
A 40-year-old woman,
Uh,
mind you.
yes, a 40-year-old. But the point is to say that, listen, we were this radical left wing group, but we've been co-opted fully now into the neoliberal order. You've got nothing to worry about. Uh, she stressed, however, the importance of green energy, and even recommended that they could put a lot of windmills in Ukraine. It's a steppe region. So the wind just goes through there. And so they had this, she outlined just the contours of a possible green energy deal that will create hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs. This is interesting because there's about 155,000 jobs in the automotive sector of the German economy that could be slashed this before the end of summer. And part of that is being fueled by, the Green New Deal. I personally, like, I'm trying to figure out what the geopolitics of this is. Now, there is global warming, and I think for America, the fear is that um, America will be far more adversely affected by global warming than Russia will. India will be badly affected. So will China. India probably more than China, but not by a lot more.
You know, it's funny that you say
Uh,
this while I'm on this computer because on my other computer, which I sometimes record the show, I actually have maps on the agricultural outputs that would that are projected by 2050, where um, the areas in green will be able to produce much more corn, rice, wheat, etc. Whereas the areas in yellow maintain about the same, might drop off 5%, gain 5%, whatever. Whereas the areas in red are the ones that are most adversely affected. You look at Europe, even like southern Europe along like close to the equator, it's almost all green and yellow. So it either like stays the same, slightly goes down, or increases. Especially Russia. Russia's just covered in green. Whereas
right,
you see a lot of
right,
sub-Saharan Africa is in the red, and the southern United States and the Mexico is in the red. But funny enough, the northern United States and Canada are mostly yellow and green. But point being is, Europe and Russia in particular stand a lot to benefit from so-called climate change with the changing in temperatures. Again, judging on how much that's actually happening and to what degree it's happening. Which again, I will admit it's happening to a degree. I think they fearmonger a lot about us, but I do think that climate conditions, whether man-made or not, or just natural cycles, are changing to favor the agriculture of Europe in particular. And I would say
right,
the Eurasian landmass going from Europe stretching into Russia, even like Siberia is warming up, etc.
right. I mean, and I did do a segment about this last year, based on an article about how it would have very adverse effects and why this was so important to Obama because he saw this as an inevitability. The primary problem for America will be the Southwest becoming more desertified and the coastal cities having to deal with rising water levels. To a lesser extent, the same thing could be said about England and the UK. But the article outlined this would probably be a boon to Russia, but also Sweden, Finland, Canada, Iceland, even Greenland. Anyways, but the green. So that's one angle of the Green New Deal. The other is also, a commodity. If people want to invest in copper because copper is absolutely necessary for building more electric cars. Never mind the hypocrisy about how much fossil fuels will have to be expended in order to get at the copper. Um, China, for instance, has a ton of copper, but they use it up completely. So they are a net importer of copper than an exporter. So look out for countries like Chile and Peru and other countries that have vast deposits of copper. It's necessary for building more batteries. This is another angle that the West could use, a shift away from gas. Yes, it's under the Green New Deal, but it's really to stifle Russia and to stifle Russia's economy. Russia isn't going to invade Europe because it sells it gas. It would make no sense. I think and to be fair to the Americans and to the NATO allies, I think what they want is even less Russian influence. But Russia is not allowed to be part owners of any EU companies. The Americans and the Europeans have enjoyed that entitlement for a long time. I don't know about now, but particularly in the 90s. So, I mean, that's what really pissed them off is when Putin stopped that from continuing in 2001 with Yukos oil. Anyhow, so yeah, she went on about the Green New Deal and more fans, and I honestly think there's a way that America uses diplomacy. Like when America wants to go to war, they like having the British because of that accent. It adds a certain amount of class. Blinken was speaking with Rob, and these are the kind of small details that impress.
You also gotta love it when you consider. Okay, so Blinken is obviously Jewish, and so is Dominic Raab, the British foreign minister, and of course they
Yeah,
employ that posh accent. But just there's something about like a Jewish guy employing that posh accent to manipulate Americans that just I find very
I don't know
very funny.
what level of dog are you on?
Yeah, it's like the absolute state of the Anglosphere.
so they've now, Tony Blair did this very well. He helped sell the war on Iraq,
And Kosovo,
and
he's a very Tony Blair is a very popular name in Kosovo to this day. Except they're all
yeah,
Albanians, so they say it Tony Blair.
he's a hero.
Thank you,
And I
USA.
think,
I'm sorry. I'll stop. I'll stop.
yeah, so I think she might be used in a similar way. She's young. She can articulate this position. She has the chops and the credentials because, after all, she's head of the Green Party. So I think they can use that. They feel like that will add a certain amount of legitimacy to convince American voters to support Germany. I have no doubt that that's going to be like her use for, the greater American empire, so to speak. So, but you're seeing a lot of that. You're seeing like true to his word. Biden. I'm not. I'm not. The rhetoric is tougher. The implications of the rhetoric seem tougher. I haven't seen the proof yet to contrast him with Trump, but apparently it's working to some degree, as we know. Australia is becoming more and more subservient to American demands. This is something John Mearsheimer, predicted back in August 2019 in Australia at a conference. So we're seeing that develop. He guessed right that Australia would choose quote unquote security over prosperity. And China has suspended, based on some leaked chats from the Australians, China has suspended their economic dialogue with them. And just to put into perspective, China is Australia's absolutely largest trading partner, like over 50%. So we'll see how that develops, but the lines are becoming more and more fixed, more drawn. The tensions are escalating. America has to make good. A lot of these changes that they want to see happen will take at least a decade. So this is going to be a long struggle. We are already in a Cold War. They might not call it that yet. They might call it Cold War, part 2.0, but we are in it, and we are going to stay in it for quite some time.
It's
And
amazing
we'll see how it goes.
just with all this Green Party stuff, and I know I pointed this out just about like 20 minutes ago, but I think it's worth reiterating how much the environmentalism and the LGBTQ CIA and the girl boss stuff, the feminism, whatever you want to call it, all those things together, while they may just be, again, they're very socially corrosive. I think everyone here is against them. I think that goes without saying. But it's amazing how a lot of people see it, and I think we've been guilty of this, as something that just tacked onto our foreign policy. When you think about it, like, these two issues are so interwoven, like, they inform each other.
Mhm.
It's not one informing the other, because these things are very useful tools on the world
Yeah.
stage, but they're also the core ideology of the ruling regime. And again, they're pretty much inseparable at that point, where you think it may just be one tacked onto the other, one shielding the other, but really, they're joined at the hip.
Right. And if you look at the history of American sponsored color revolutions, right, they always develop, the rhetoric develops in a very predictable manner. So if the regime that they want to change is conservative, and 9 out of 10 times it is, then the protesters will, to some ambiguous level, will keep reiterating slogans about freedom. It will just be about freedom. That was particularly the case in the 90s and the early 2000s with respect to Eastern Europe. So just vague stuff about freedoms. We want more freedom. We want more freedom, which is basically saying we want more power. And now some of that rhetoric has changed. So you see in Eastern Europe, they can't use the argument of freedom. So they use the argument of corruption, right? In other places, like in Hong Kong, they're still at the earlier stage. So they use freedom. In the, in the American color revolution of 2020, uh, generally it was social justice, but implicit was freedom, right? So, in the neoliberal empire, for the markets to come in and establish themselves into one of these countries, the rhetoric of freedom must first precede it. And once that's done, then, in a sense, those corporations, whether they're Burger King or Raytheon, they indicate that freedom has been achieved. It's lame, and yet there's an esoteric quality to it, right? In the way that protests themselves they're LARPs, but they're also esoteric. They're a religious right in democracies. And I'm not being flippant about that. In no way. I absolutely mean it. So that's the predominant ideology. That's how all things are framed. And so, and as we know, successful protests are an informal way of indicating who is actually in power. And so we know that from 2020. And so, yes, so the rhetoric, the esoteric side is blathering on about freedom and demonstrations, usually well funded, and then the ousting of the leader and American and Western European companies moving in, and that's the way it works. That's the way democracy works.
Yeah, and really, I think you summed up better than I could, and it is funny how, and again, not that I support voting, not that I support elections, any of this kind of stuff. I am pretty pro autocracy at this point. I'll outright admit that. But it's like a pseudo democracy when you consider the definition of democracy, like the will of the people and what they actually vote for. Especially when you look at Ireland's a really good example when they had 3 or 4 different European Union accession referendums before they finally caved and eventually let them into the European Union after they voted it down like however many times. Or when you have, for example, the Supreme Court in the United States forcing through things like abortion or the gay marriage issue or a number of different things where again like democracy has become so ritualized beyond the point of it just being the process where the majority or like 2/3 or whatever your set margin is decides what direction, what policy we're going to take. And again, I think you summed it up really well with that, but I just wanted to tack that on there.
No, it's a good point because that's another angle of understanding how modern democracies work, right? The voice, so to speak, has to come from the people. But if it's not what the elites want, and part of democracy is to conceal who actually is in power, uh, then that election is negated until the people understand how to vote. And of course, the whole apparatus of media is thrown in to create consent. It's very well honed in. America understands this. They've bottled, as it were, and it's basically a patent on democracy that America has created, has manufactured. Actually, would be a better term.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And just cleaning up the European news, I'll touch real quick on the fact that Europe is now begging for more vaccine imports from the United States because of shortages. And this is, of course, shortly after I believe Macron questioned the Pfizer vaccine back a couple months ago, and also them putting restrictions on the importation of Russian and Chinese vaccines, with a few exceptions. For example, no surprise, Hungary imported some. You had Serbia also import Russian and Chinese ones. Not that they're part of the European Union, but I would say they're pretty solidly under their sphere of influence at this point, for better or for worse, which I would say is worse, but that's aside the point. And again, I go back to the point on two things. Number one, it's clearly not the international health crisis you claim it is when you have the ability to be that discriminatory with what vaccines or what medications you give to people who are at risk or suffering from this virus. It's obviously not that big of a deal, or else you would have capitulated and taken Russian aid already. Number two, it shows between, again, the Russian and, to my understanding, the Chinese vaccines are much more traditional when it comes to the small dosage of the virus and building the immunity to it. Whereas you have like the mRNA vaccines in the West, in the United States in particular, that mess with the proteins. Again, I'm no doctor, but I'm explaining these to my best to my abilities. And just as somebody who has no medical experience, I would say the one where you just use the actual virus to build an immunity sounds much more reliable, much more safe. But again, I do think it's some sort of weird agenda that like they won't just like let this straightforward vaccine that's been developed how most other vaccines have been. That's the problem. That's where we draw the line. And again, maybe the issues with the Pfizer and Moderna and like all these other vaccines in the United States when it comes to health issues and people dying, maybe that is exaggerated. I really can't say for sure. But I think it's very telling when they say you have to take these ones, and we even want to implement a passport system that says we can certify that you took this, but if you want to go take that other ones, you don't qualify for a passport system, and you might as well not even have gotten it. And again, I think it's very weird, especially when you're trying to claim this is the worst thing since the Spanish flu. And out of all the things, out of everything, I would say this dispute over vaccines in countries of origin has probably done the most damage to the credibility of this actually being a crisis, at least in my eyes.
Yes, good points. I would just add two or three things. You know, when you hear, it was a great point you brought up. The worst pandemic in 100 years, but not so bad. But you know what's worse? Russia. So we won't take their vaccine. Uh, they were already kind of shown up when Russia flew aid to Italy, and they don't want to repeat in 2021 after that fiasco. And it sounds an awful lot like the George Floyd protests. Um, yes, the most deadliest pandemic will take a year to even get past this, over a year to even get past this thing. But you know what's even more dangerous? Racism.
Racism.
So, so So yeah, it's hard to believe, and plus there was a great article written in Strategic Culture about the rates of COVID and COVID lethality. I kind of just pay attention to what is the census for this year? How many people died? How many people were born? Particularly how many people died. And let's compare that to the last 3-4 years prior. If it's more, then something indeed is happening. And something like that is indeed happening. But what is it? I'm not always sure. You have the article is amazing because it didn't really give you an answer. You could, if you're on either side of this debate, you weren't going to find the information that proved your side. So they took a look at uh, Denmark versus Sweden, and then Denmark, Sweden, and the other Nordic countries, Finland and Norway. Sweden started out fine. They didn't have some crazy death rate. They were doing better than even some countries which had already started certain COVID restrictions, mask wearing, lockdowns, etc. And then they end up 2020 in a worse position. But then you have these strange anomalies where Belgium is doing no better, in fact, worse than Sweden, and they were one of the first with restrictions and lockdowns. Then you have other examples. So the biggest lethality rate in the world at this moment. So that means how many people are dying because of COVID. So it's attributed to COVID. per 100,000. Well, that's Hungary. But who's second place? Second place is the country that first mandated wearing masks in Europe, and that's Czech Republic. They're second worst. So that's another example where it doesn't seem to make sense. America, by the way, is not even in the top 10 of the worst per 100,000 deaths. Britain, I believe, is number 10. Russia is I think, 20th place. It's 75 per 100,000. Compare that to the top five countries, which are about between 220 to 228 per 100,000. So those are the actual, that's the raw data. But I think something else is being created. We talked about Cold War 2.0, and there's going to be a need for restriction. And in some ways, it's unlike the first Cold War. There's a sense in the West, and particularly in America, with more divided societies, that we're going to have to limit the movement of even certain individuals. We have to find a way to track them, a way to keep an eye on them, or a way to shove them aside from polite society, which also includes having a job.
Oh, of course.
So I think this is going to be a gradual rollout. Now, this is something that there's no way during the first Cold War they could have risked such a thing. In Berlin City, yes, but Western Europe wasn't Berlin City.
Like even
So
the crackdowns on the communists, you think Joseph McCarthy, all that kind of stuff in the 50s, early 60s, none of that ever went as far as what we see today.
yeah,
The Hollywood blacklist, all this kind of stuff. Like, yeah, there is political repression in every society. And if you don't think there is, it's because you're an ally of the ruling regime. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I would. There's certain people I would love to strip of their rights. Let's just say that. But um, every society has political repression. It's just two factors: which side are you on, and how overt is it? And a lot of it, it's tolerable. It's like, we won't explicitly crack on you for even having these sympathies. Just shut up about it in public. And you think that those are places like Russia and China where you may not like Putin, you may not like the CCP and Xi Jinping. You can even participate in some limited demonstrations against them. I would say much more so in Russia than China. But just keep your mouth shut for the most part, and you'll be fine. You'll be good. But you question mass migration in Germany or the UK, you're liable to land yourself a government fine, if not, harassment by the police in a further sense. You do it in the United States or Canada or one of these other countries, you're liable to get doxxed, lose your job, and have all sorts of non-legal but social ramifications towards you. So again, every regime is repressive. It's just the means and it's just the motive that it comes down to.
right. And in terms of repressive and effective regimes, we really have something developing in the U.S. and it's I believe it's going to catch on in Europe. I mean, it already has to a great extent in, let's say, Britain, but let's just focus on the U.S. because that's where it's most acute. And that is, if the elite, if the state doesn't like you, it has its cadres, it has its believers that are going to out you. They're going to physically intimidate you. They're going to find out where you live. You're going to lose your job. You're going to have to move. You're going to lose your friends. You're going to lose your relatives. And you're not going to have a livelihood. Now, even in the worst circumstances of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, you would still have a job. You would be reprimanded, but you would still have a job. You would go back to work. You could have a livelihood. You could provide for your family. It was not fathomable that you would deprive this person of a livelihood, and whatever repercussions that had on their family was secondary. It was
I
irrelevant.
mean, you would assume
That,
this is like a breeding ground for terrorism and insurgency when you take literally everything worth living for away from these people. What else are they going to do?
right, right. And so, and this is what I mean. So for them, when they say, white supremacy is the greatest danger, this is what they're talking about. You know, I've said it often in my personal life, and I've said it on the show that the implicit messaging, particularly from 2014 and onwards, has been that the kind of democratic utopia you want cannot be achieved without first disprivileging whites, and it that's the guarantee. If you do that, it all hinges on this, right? That's the ticket. And so the pressure continues. I mean, this is why Trump was elected in the first place, because it was considered that he could be this salvo against this system, that it could delay it or even turn it around for the more hopeful. Um, so I think COVID restrictions will work in the same way. They know who is going to be most likely hesitant to take the vaccine. So there's information, there's data to glean from that. The restrictions will make it not only more difficult to cross borders from country to country, but cross borders from like a country that's not affiliated with another country on good terms. So, of course, this means Russia. This will also mean Belarus. It may mean Serbia as well.
Well, it's
China,
actually funny you mentioned that because I saw this article. It just popped up in my news feed about 12 countries you can travel to as an American. Of course, most of them had the caveat, oh, if you're vaccinated and you can prove it, you can come here. But it's just Serbia. It's like, yeah, we'll take your tourists. It's okay. So, again, it this has become a new facet of this Cold War. I would say it's even beyond a Cold War. I would say we are truly in another era of great power politics that we haven't seen since before World War One. I'm going to go that far with it. You may disagree with me, whatever, but the point being is that's just the perspective I'm operating from here. And what we were saying in early 2020, you go back and listen to our shows from January, February, even March. We thought this was going to be this amazing, crushing blow to neoliberalism, to the liberal world order. In a way, many ways it has been. The United States has lost a lot of legitimacy. The European Union has lost a lot of legitimacy. Just all these things that have happened. We've covered them extensively. But it's also been one of the biggest saving graces for them when you see how much they've refortified. Whether that be with the Black Lives Matter protests, whether that be with again just these drives about like wear your mask, stay get vaccinated, stay healthy, blah blah, all these canned public health service announcements. Of course, the election of Joe Biden against Trump, and it's been amazing how quickly they were able to seize on this crisis or perceived crisis and completely operate to their favor. When I was thinking in my foolish optimistic days of last year and a half ago, pretty much at this point, a year and a few months ago, okay, year and a quarter ago, it's May 2021, so yeah, about a year and 3 months ago, February 2020, I was thinking, well, by all means, this is going to be a great chance for not only the right wing in America, but the right wing in Europe and the right wing across the world to seize power. And it's going to be a great blow to globalism. It's going to disprove a lot of things. We're going to get decoupling from China. Pretty much I think the only prediction of those that came true was the decoupling from China. For much different reasons I was expecting, mind you. But point being is, it is a stark contrast, since sometimes I go back and will review my own work, listen to it, see what I can improve on, or just go back to listen to my own predictions and see how they came true. And it's just so stark how differently not only us but probably everyone who would watch the show in this audience right now and again knows who we are. It's just such a it's like a complete 180 from what I was expecting, and I'm boggled by it.
Yeah, I mean they've gone to work. They have got to rescue this project. They are at least 4 years behind, and much has changed in those 4 years. So, I mean, think about it. If Hillary had gotten in, would Russia have been able to create or help create a alternative to SWIFT? How far would have the Nord Stream 2 have gone? Uh, you know, Granted, I think the construction for Nord Stream 2 actually began with Obama, and he didn't, as far as I recall, he didn't levy any sanctions
Well,
on
wasn't
Russia
that
for it. Other
pre-Crimea where they thought
sanctions.
Russia could still be integrated into this behemoth?
Well, Yeah, I'm not
Even though
so sure.
Georgia had
I think
happened by that point, but I don't know whether it's because they thought they could still be conciliatory or whether they just wrote it off saying it's not that big of a deal. Like it's probably they didn't think it was that big of a deal at the time, but again, it is strange just to see like how much things have escalated again since the Obama administration.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I personally think that the opinion after Georgia was that that was it. That it that it could not that America had any other, not that America's plans for Ukraine would have changed. I mean, America vis-a-vis Soros was trying to take Ukraine away from Russia since the early 90s. That's obvious. There's lots of literature on that. Uh, However, would Russia retaliate? Could Russia retaliate? Uh, you have to look at Russian integration through that lens. And I think after 2008, it was obvious that Russia could not, that it still had a lot of fight and it was willing to take great chances, you know?
Yes.
Um, so, and that threw the Americans off. Not that the Americans were ever going to go and save the Georgians. They weren't. Uh, does that mean that
Wait, are you
the
telling me
Americans?
Saakashvili lied to me?
Yeah, I mean, not that the Americans thought Russia would be as successful as they were, but I think what they were hoping for was that Russia would get bogged down in a war with Georgia, and Georgia was expendable. And instead, it was a very clean in out. It destroyed for a long time, and to this day, Georgia is not in NATO. It's not in the EU, so it destroyed its chances of getting in for we don't know how long.
And to my
Um,
understanding, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are still under separatist control, aren't they?
they are, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought, and it's been 13 years and almost 13 years. Give it a few months, but point being is, and especially in comparison to the Ukrainian conflict, if you think that the Donbass has been under separatist occupation for that long, again, you should see what Georgia's dealing with it right here, and again, it shows the wherewithal of these groups, how much they can entrench themselves in, and really just the lack of will of these statelets. Now, of course, Georgia is much more of a statelet than Ukraine, but I think Ukraine qualifies for being a statelet in just the way it functions and the way its politics work. A country that, an artificial state, I should say, a country that doesn't really have any business existing, isn't even quite sure how to exist itself, doesn't have the storied history that some of these other countries, even for example, I mean, Germany is a young state, but they're a very old nation, and they've existed in various forms throughout their history. But the Ukrainians, with their half-ass ethnogenesis and a lot of their eastern population still being Russian, and the fact that they have Frankenstein borders, really the only way I can put it is, yeah, they don't have the will. A lot of Ukrainians don't have the will to shut down what's going on in the Donbass. Now, of course, a lot do, and those are the people who join things like Azov. But at the end of the day, that's what it really comes down to: just the will of these countries to govern themselves. And while they're nationalists and while these people might talk a big game, when push comes to shove, they aren't delivering.
Mhm. Yeah.
But with all that being said, because I deliberate so long, I just want to close out with one last news topic, which is the UK local elections. Now, there was not a general election, so the seat of Prime Minister was not up. And what you had happening there was the Conservatives in England proper swept Labour. Now, that's no surprise. Even with Boris Johnson's questionable leadership, I think he's. And again, you're asking me to pick between political parties and these sort of things. But when you see it, I still think, despite his draconian lockdowns, Labour, a left wing government, would be worse. Not to mention, Labour doesn't really have a figurehead. They can't decide whether they want to be more of a socialistic party or go back to like a center left neoliberalism. But that's not the big news. I think everyone expected that. What is the big news, and I think everyone also expects this, is The SNP made gains in Scotland, but even greater, and it's bringing back the question of secession to the forefront. And of course, they had the referendum back in 2014 that was just barely not approved by the Scottish population who chose to remain within the UK. And one of the big dividing lines of the Brexit vote was England versus Scotland. A lot of the English population, especially in northern England, a lot of the deindustrialized areas, were very pro Brexit. They wanted to get out, they wanted to cut ties. Well, maybe not entirely cut ties, but go their separate ways from the European Union. Whereas the Scottish were very content with being in the European Union, and it's sort of the situation in Northern Ireland where the UK government said, well, if you want to have another referendum again, by all means, I guess you can have it. And it's looking like that question is being brought to the forefront again. And really, we talked about this about a year and a half ago with the possibility of the breakup of the UK. And I wouldn't be surprised. I think actually, out of all the Western countries, it's the most likely to fracture. And to give a reasonable comparison, I think compared to 20, 30 years ago, maybe like post Franco Spain, we're much more likely to see an independent Scotland than we are to see an independent Catalonia.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to bet on either, but if I had to choose, it is looking more that way. Part of it is, in a way, Spain doesn't care if the rest of Europe disagrees with them keeping Catalonia in within Spain. It
I'm
like
sorry, but I had to mention, just bringing up Spain, how much of just a contradiction paradox of a country it is, especially in terms of Western Europe, where within the same country that you have some of the most left wing policies in Europe, you also have one of the biggest, like, quote unquote, neo fascist movements in Europe as well. I mean, it helps that they were under Franco for 40 years, but again, and where even the left wing government at the time sent in, like, the federal police or whatever they call them there to crack down on the referendum, not even just saying your referendum means nothing and saying, no, we will not recognize your referendum and you will be punished for having this. Um, I have to admit, I kind of relish in Catalonians being crushed yet again in the, for the second time in less than a century. But that's aside the point right here. I'm the news has put me in a very good mood today. Conversely enough, but that's all aside the point. And again, just the way it's been, and again, I don't see. I would like to imagine like the British police, their little baton things, trying to be like, "Oh, bruv, you don't have a license for this referendum," and in Scotland, but I don't see that happening. They have too many online racists to take care of. Okay, look, that guy said dudes in dresses, they're not women. He's look, he doesn't have a license to say that. He looks like the police are going to have to pay him a visit. But point being, getting back on topic is, yeah, the UK is in dire straits. I'm not saying I see this union fracturing, but I think this union is the closest it has been to fracturing that it's ever been. And I would also say that the ramifications of an independent Scotland, which is a very real possibility going into the future, would not only create a Cold War battleground on the British Isles, but it would also open up the possibility of, again, Northern Ireland, those six counties just straggling in the distance over there, just reuniting with Ireland proper. Because at that rate, I mean, I I think the Northern Irish, I think they went for Brexit. I can't remember exactly, but I think they were more pro Brexit than not. But at that point, with the loss of prestige, with the loss of just the even economic resources of Scotland, there's more than you'd think. There's actually a sizable energy industry out of Scotland, especially along the coastline. But I could see why the Unionists in Northern Ireland might lose confidence in the government in London and choose to reunite with Ireland for better or for worse. Now, again, I'm not saying any of this is going to happen, but it would create an interesting dynamic between Anglosphere influence, whether that be like the U.S., Australia, Canada, whatever, mainly the U.S., courting England versus the European Union courting Scotland. Of course, Scotland would want to join the European Union for their foothold in Ireland, and it would create a very divided British Isles, which I think would, it wouldn't be a powder keg like in a military standpoint, but in terms of like a the unity of Europe and the United States and them pursuing one course, I think that would cause a lot of problems having a divided British Isles.
Yeah, I mean, and you can put this into a wider context. Of course, there was the vote a few years ago for independence. That was a close outcome. But you see all kinds of fracturing taking place. Just a few days ago, the Isle of Jersey, the fishing rights dispute between France and England, France and the UK, sorry, both deploying military vessels, Navy vessels. That in itself is going to, I think, play a role because for Scotland, because if the EU seems weak, I think the support for breaking from the Union will also weaken. And if the EU seems to be doing better, well then, um, what argument will England have to stay for them to stay in the Union? Um, without sounding nationalistic, well, they're going to have to talk about the values of freedom, personal freedom, individual freedom. Scotland's not opposed to any of those things. This separation is not on any of those quote unquote fundamental Western values. So, what's the catch going to be? The only one I could think of is, besides, you're going to be poorer without us. Or, the retort, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there, is, you could end up um, undermining the UK because you might be swayed by Putin. Like, they'll have to bring out some kind of a boogeyman
Oh, of
as to
course.
why it's imperative that Scotland not break away, right? Because the reasons to stay are not, uh, besides you're going to be poorer, they're not going to be there, and they're all extraneous anyways, right? All of this will depend on how well the EU does without Britain, right? But I think in many ways, America has a safeguard if the EU goes along the same path as Australia has been going. Well, I mean, they are going to choose security over prosperity, and if the EU is equally unprosperous as the UK, and this is a UK that more and more looks like it is, their only role is to be a junior role of America. Um, then what incentive will the Scots have to separate? So that could be another strategy, in the way that the Trump administration particularly wanted there to be a split that, to me, reflects that a certain amount of uh, elites, movers, and shakers in America thought that, for long-term strategy, you want the UK out of NATO because the predictors are that NATO might warm up to Russia and China anyways,
Yeah, I think this goes along
and we're
the
going.
line of thought that we go back to all the time, where Michael Flynn had a vision for the future that did not bode well for the United States and started looking at what gangrenous limbs can we cut off from this empire to preserve ourselves. And I think he saw
Yes.
a lot of Europe as that. I'm not saying the entirety of Europe, but again, I think he saw that, look, if we can shore up the UK, if we can reevaluate our position in the world, we might have to take some hits. We might have to take some hits in global influences. Russia and China might grow, but in the long term, it's better and more sustainable for us if we retreat and entrench ourselves. And I think slowly but surely, a lot among the American elite are realizing that it's just too late when they could have had that opportunity with Trump and Michael Flynn and the various other, at least original foreign policy team Trump had. But I think they're realizing, and too late for that matter, that they were right.
Right. And, so his predictions were more or less right, where the trends were going. And you see, you see in the way that Britain behaves, uh, Blinken is saying, well, we will retaliate. We'll give appropriate response to Russian aggression. And Rob is like this, he's salivating nearly, going off about Navalny or, evil Russia. He didn't say evil Russia. I think people know I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but um, all to say that he had a more assertive message in a more like confrontational message than Blinken did. So it that was funny to see because in a way that's Britain's role right now is to be like a junior America partner.
Yeah, I would say so, and really, that's sort of the fate they chose for themselves. It was stuck between being ensnared with the European Union, being ensnared with the United States. I would say there was a brief window there right after Brexit with maybe some more competent leadership to forge a what were they calling it, like Canazuk Union between Canada, Australia, New
Yeah.
Zealand, and the UK, where they could have been their own bloc. Of course, it would have been heavily integrated in line with the United States, but it's sort of, for lack of a better term, very simplistic term, could have been a neo-British empire that was able to be a secondary power on the world stage, similar to what you might think of, you know, maybe the European Union in its current form, or yeah, but you may think that like, oh yeah, the British can assert themselves as a power play in the world again, and now it's just that they're the auxiliary corps of the United States, and they're eyes and ears in Europe. And I think that was another big debate among the American elite. Do we bring them more integrated into us with a Brexit, or do we keep them in the European Union as our voice, as a wedge in there, as an Anglophone country within there? And it's even funny, you have all this, you have Brexit, and you have seemingly a lot of European leaders and even a lot of European people happy about it. You'd think that the Gaullists have won the day with the UK being excluded from the European Union, but you still have Brussels adding English as an official language of the Union.
Right, right. So the influence is there, though diminished. I would say that this Anglo Pact, as it were, of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and Great Britain, with probably the addition of America, is already informally there. It may come about anyways out of necessity. And I also wondered to what extent did the outcome in Ukraine play for Britain leaving the EU? That is, did they foresee, rightly or wrongly, that Ukraine itself might become a drain? It might have adverse effects on the UK. Did they see that maybe propping up Ukraine required Britain to leave the EU? Because one of the things that you see in the Biden administration, in all the interviews on the Atlantic Council as well, is that Germany did not present the kind of leadership that was necessary under Merkel, and they did not support their Eastern European partners, let's say Poland, for instance. And Poland and Ukraine are quite disappointed, so on and so forth. So I wonder. I think on some level Ukraine played a role in it. However, the vote was given. But it's one of those things that I wonder. I mean, the main issues for Brits were immigration and also territorial disputes that have an economic impact,
And I do think
and so.
the one last thing I'll leave the show with, for that matter, is the British people, especially among the older generations, I would say the ruling elite now, were the ones who were growing up and became young adults by the time the empire was in its final days, when you had a lot of them passing the baton to independent governments from being colonies. You may think various places in Africa, Asia, etc. And I do think just the way they were raised, and of course their parents' generation would have been the one that fought in World War II and everything, they still have, maybe even just subconsciously, this conception of the British as the empire in which the sun never sets. And I think it's becoming a very hard reality, especially among the younger generations, as they're relegated into a secondary power, if even status.
Mhm. Yeah.
But that's all I have for this edition of the War Report, unless you have any major news topics that we forgot. We're pushing the hour and a half mark, so I think,
No, that's all
well,
I have.
this show is much longer than I expected, which I find myself saying at the end of every show. And, here we were before the show saying, no, I don't think any of these topics will be too long. We probably won't talk for anything more than like 20 minutes or so. And then we spend 40 minutes talking about the German Green Party. But that's just the way this show works. You guys seem to enjoy it. I enjoy doing it, definitely. So I guess we'll see you guys next time. We finally have a show up on Saturday. You're welcome. But we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care.